the baby boomers enter the workforce. The last baby boomer enters the workforce. Mm-hmm. So you've got this period, which we refer to as the Great Inflation, which most people think of as being a monetary phenomena. I think is a demographic phenomenon. I can prove it in every chart that I look at, proves that it was demographics. The monetary side, of course, played a role. But the reality was, if you were to put the same setup anywhere in the world, regardless of what you're pegged against, you've got the same demand shock and the world can't keep up. Right now, as we're talking, we've got a supply shock. You know, the demand has risen to normal levels, but supply has massively contracted, so prices rise. That tends to be offset quite quickly because as things come on, the general level of prices stabilizes again. Sure, the price doesn't fall, it never goes back, you know, but it kind of stabilizes. So the other part of that equation is not the inflation. The really big story is the one that nobody understands, is that wages stopped going up. So in real terms, obviously, if you add a record number of people, like if you added record immigrants into the US right now, what happens? Wages don't go up. And in fact, they never went up again. In real terms, since 1975, wages haven't gone up. They've gone up 0.3% a year for the median American. GDP grew because of financialization. I'll come on to that in a minute. This is where the real crux of the issue starts. So you put all these people in the workforce and you compete with each other. So they start competing for wages. So guess what? Nobody needs to pay higher wages. And so these people have been promised the American dream. That was the dream of the 50s. They saw their parents have that, and the baby boomers never got any of it. They got something entirely different. They got this weird world where fiat currency was being gradually debased, not like we have these days, but gradually debased by inflation and money supply issues, stuff like that. And asset prices start to rise and their wages don't. And this is the key thing, is if your assets rise and your wages don't, your future self is poorer, because an asset is a way of storing wealth for future consumption. But within this is an uglier picture as well, is the fact that if you split the population down with kind of percentiles, the lower percentiles saw zero increase in wages, complete zero. So, the worker working in flipping burgers, a factory worker, zero increase. Right. The average, the median, as we said, the median worker saw about a 33% increase in real wages in 50 years, which is incredible compared to what happened to GDP and productivity. Right. Average guy, because it takes into account the really wealthy skew, well, their wages have gone up 100% over those 50 years. So you're already seeing that bifurcation in people. So then if you think of that, and we'll come on to a lot more about this in a bit, but if you think of politics now, you think of the left and the right and the extremes of left and right, I'm talking about not the middle ground, but the extremes of left and right are both really fucking angry because they've been left behind. And nobody knows why, so they blame it on politics. The reality is it's people having too many kids. So they are really angry because both those parties have this base of the poor, but in different parts of the country. And those guys' lives never improved. They were promised a dream that never happened. They live in the world's richest nation and they never got any of it. And then all they're bombarded with is the imagery of the beautiful rich getting richer and how great America is. And they're like, well, what happened to us? Of course you're going to cause populism, not doing things that we've done in the past. Things that feel crazy or wrong to us are going to have to be tried and tested, because we cannot simply keep flipping. Well, we're going to support people in certain ways on the left, or we're going to hope we can get rich people to trickle down their wealth to poor people. I mean, we've done the same fucking thing now for 40 years and it doesn't work. Right? These people's wages have never gone up. Their standard of living has not gone up. Yes, it's gone up because their longevity. No, the median American's longevity of life has barely risen as well because of, diet and all of the issues that has come. But where it gets really ugly is, and this is where the money part comes in and a whole bunch of other stuff, globalization, is Reagan and Thatcher come along. And it was really Thatcher who drove a lot of this. She figured out something really clever, and it seemed a good idea, but it had unintended consequences, as everything does. Thatcher's idea was, in England, we had what's known as council houses, free housing for low-income families. They were, one of the benefits, like the National Health Service that came out of World War II, where we're like, we need to help people part of that big fiscal stimulus that came and the restructuring of the political landscape. So people were living in these houses for free, and Margaret Thatcher decides, okay, what makes a conservative voter in the UK? A conservative voter is generally a house owner because they are more tied to the economy. So, and Labour voters, the left side of the spectrum in the UK, tend to prefer state support. Okay, fine. The same left-right divide we're talking about. So Margaret Thatcher does a piece of genius, political genius, and I'd have said economic genius initially, which was, we're going to sell them these houses at ridiculously underpriced rates, and we're going to free these people. And that was a great idea. And the Conservatives won a lot of votes, obviously, because you're giving away assets for nothing. And people who couldn't afford housing now can afford housing, and etc. It wasn't great quality housing, but it was an asset. But the issue is you turned all of these people into debtors, and they were creditors before because they didn't have access to debts because they had no assets. And now you've turned all of the poor people into debtors, and they've now become slaves. Reagan sees the same thing and realizes that credit is his solution. So there's a massive deregulation goes on in the credit markets, and the rise of Wall Street happens. So the world starts financializing at an unprecedented rate. Both Reagan and Thatcher start, and then others afterwards start freeing up the pension system as well and start driving things like 401k. So now people can invest in the markets, but that has another counterbalance, which is stock prices go up and people can afford less of them with their hourly wages. Property starts going up because people can now get access to debt and nobody can afford anything. So everyone's on the hamster wheel now, running and running and running, and nobody can catch up. And their wages aren't going up. So what do? Well, humans generally are pretty rational, or they make rational choices that appear rational and then become irrational in due course. Humans are pretty good at that. So they start thinking, well, if I borrow money, I can make up the difference. My wages aren't going up, but the asset goes up, so I'll borrow a bit more. So I think I've got the numbers here. So if you look at the asset prices over this period, if you look at it per hour worked in terms of income, gold is now all-time highs. Equities, all-time highs. Well, your purchasing power is at all-time lows, basically, versus every asset except these variable assets like oil, where you can produce more of it. So what happens is this process is slow at first, but it starts accelerating as more people buy equities because of the pension system. It becomes harder to then make sizable investments. These start going up. They make it easier, create index funds. It creates more of a loop. Meanwhile, everyone's like, fuck, I need to put money in my 401k. I can't afford healthcare. And healthcare starts exploding. Why? 78 million Americans are in the healthcare market at the same time. Duh, obviously. So then that whole thing explodes. So they just borrow more money to fill the gap. And what I did is I took household income, real household income, and added debt component, and it basically then starts to mirror what happened to prices in assets. So they were doing what they thought was the right thing, is to maintain my standard of living, I need to borrow money. And that creates this financialization bonanza in the 80s that leads to the 87 crash, because everybody is now piling in to everything by borrowing money to be able to do this, to be able to participate, because they've got the American dream. Is I want to be rich. I should be rich. But they're not being rich because they're in debt. People confuse this.